thanks for coming, and I hope I can live up to the billing. Nicholas said I should talk for about an hour. Is that right? Is that fair enough? In which case, what I'll try and do is draw together some work that I've been doing in several different projects lately. I'll draw that together with some initial thoughts I'm having towards a history of ICT4D. And a kind of projection of the direction of that field into the future. And that's a proposed book project which is in its very early stages. So what I'll give you today are my early thoughts, not my final thoughts, on those sorts of subjects. But I'd be really interested to get feedback from you on what you think about what I've got to say. So I'll start with a brief history of ICT4D, and then I'll go on to question some of the assumptions that have underpinned it and which I think are problematic. I'll summarise aspects of recent work that I've done on two things: on ICTs and sustainability for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and work I've done on the impact of emerging information technology trends on development for the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development, CSTD. Then I'll use those to suggest some points about the future direction of ICT4D, and I'll end with some comments on the relationship. I did have a slide for that, you know. I'll end with some comments on the relationship between these things and the post-2015 development agenda, which I think Richard Heeks talked about a few weeks ago. Okay, so that's quite a lot to try and get in. I'll start with the history. I'll divide the history of ICT and development into four main phases. So phase one, which I call indifference, began with the Maitland Commission, which was set up by the ITU in 1983 to investigate what we now call the digital divide. And it pointed out that telephone access in developing countries was confined to government, big business and the rich, with telephone density rates in Africa around 0.1% of population. It suggested this was both morally wrong and economically harmful to both North and South, and it called for cross-subsidies to unlock social and economic development value. Now that commission, how many of you are familiar with it? Anyone read its report? Okay, that commission's often hailed as the origin of ICT4D, but in fact it was largely ignored for the following decade. In fact, as late as 2003, at the start of the World Summit on the Information Society, it was impossible to get a copy of it anywhere online. So in the decade after the commission, up to the mid-90s, development agencies took the view that telecoms was an elite product of little value to the poor, and so of little interest to them. And in any case, the private sector would invest where telecoms had economic value, so it didn't need to concern them from an investment point of view. And the result of that scenario was really quite rapid growth in telephone numbers in Asia and Latin America, but none at all in Africa, and almost no interest in ICTs as development tools. So that would be my first phase. Phase two began in the mid-1990s, and by contrast I'd call it idolatry, or at least enthusiasm. And its sober side is exemplified in the report on the left, published in 1998 by my colleague at LSE, Robin Mansell, called Knowledge Societies, which illustrated how ICTs were affecting development outcomes and could be used to affect development outcomes, drawing especially on Asian experience, the experience of the dynamic economies in the Southeast Asia region and Korea, the Philippines, and so forth. And it represents what I call the information society as an observable phenomenon. And at first, this observable phenomenon intrigued the development community. The first meeting that DFID had DFID UK had to discuss whether information technology was interesting for development was in 1996, and it was a seminar that I did with James Dean, who's now at BBC Media Action. So there was a kind of interest in the development community generally, but this was quickly overtaken by what I would say is a much less critical analysis, and I think that's exemplified by the World Bank's 1998 World Development Report. Sorry about this, but it began, and I'll quote this, it began in a sort of New Age style, which is not the sort of thing you expect from the World Bank. Knowledge is like light, it said. Weightless and intangible, it can easily travel the world, enlightening the lives of people everywhere. And it then described how this magic bullet of knowledge, propelled by new digital technology, would transform the development potential of low-income countries. There's an account by Kenneth King and Simon McGrath of this as an attempt by the new World Bank president of the time, James Wolfenson, to stamp his personal identity on the bank's work. And that vision that was expressed there actually was representative in many ways of a wave of enthusiasm for ICTs and development in the late 1990s, as some people in the development community, some only, but some, were bewitched by the magic of the internet, seduced by the dot-com bubble, captivated by the idea that developing countries could use information technology to, a word that was often used, leapfrog a century of failure to deliver social and economic gains. And this is what I would call the information society's aspirational vision, a vision that was driven to a large extent by technological determinism. That word leapfrog had a hideous African variant, which was a number of people claim to have invented, which is called cheetah pole vaulting. You may come across that at some time. Bizarre idea. And with the apogee of this aspirational vision came in the World Summit on the Information Society in two phases in 2003 and 2005. And I would see that as when the industry, the ICT industry, and advocates of ICT4D joined together to promote their technology as the new solution for development challenges. Now, I think it's worth remembering who was actually participating in the summit. Because the summit was overwhelmingly attended by people from the traditional telecommunications environment. Most of the government delegates were from ICT ministries, state-owned phone companies, and phone regulators. There were very few people from ministries of finance or development planning or mainstream development ministries like health and education. And the approach of these ICT believers relied very much on government programs to stimulate ICT-enabled outcomes, as they assumed that people and organizations would not take these up quickly enough to take full advantage of them if they were left to their own devices, as you might say. So the core of the WSIS outcome documents, the World Summit outcome documents, concerns what governments should do to maximize the potential of what they saw as an essential catalyst for development. Telecentres were perhaps the emblematic symbol of this approach. As an aside, I think I'd say we can see something of the same technology-led and dirigiste approach in the work of the Broadband Commission for Digital Development now, which is a partnership between the ITU, UNESCO, and the chief executives of ICT sector companies, which sees broadband as a similarly essential catalyst for development in general. So the difficulty which ICT advocates had in this phase, however, and I think it's a difficulty they still have today, is that while they were convinced by the importance of ICTs in achieving development outcomes, the mainstream development community was not convinced and not persuaded. And as my cartoon here suggests, non-ICT development professionals thought that ICT advocates had little understanding of development realities and of the constraints which face development practitioners, especially in least developed countries. They accused ICT4D advocates of failing to contextualize their solutions in the real social and economic environments that development addresses. So those are environments characterized by weak infrastructure, weak governance, inadequate finance, poor human capital resources, limited ability to absorb innovation, very often by conflict, corruption, and natural disaster. It's notable that the ICTs do not appear, and I'm taking a different view here from Richard a few weeks ago, ICTs do not appear in any of the 7 meaningful Millennium Development Goals which emerged at the same time as this wave of enthusiasm for ICT4D at the start of the century as the core development objectives, by which I mean the 7 MDGs that address challenges of poverty reduction and basic needs. They do appear, but only appear in the 8th and final Millennium Development Goal, which is to develop a global partnership for development, and only in its 6th and final target, which was to make available the benefits of new technologies, especially information and communications. So including ICTs as part of the last target of a rag-bag goal, which put together those things that hadn't been included in the other goals, doesn't seem to me like making them central to development thinking. It seems to me like an afterthought. So the World Summit increased the awareness and interest of developing country governments in ICTs and their potential, undoubtedly so. But after the summit, there was a sharp decline in development agency funding. Contrary to what most of the ICT4D community expected, development agencies saw the end of the summit as an opportunity to downgrade their engagement, to drop the issue. Some washed their hands of it entirely. Many moved on to other things which were fresh at the top of the development agenda, climate change being a particular example. And ICT4D advocates at this point, I would suggest, turn to mainstreaming ICTs within other development sectors. A positive move, in my view, because it had a couple of results which helped to move things on from enthusiasm to a more rational understanding of what ICTs could do. If you mainstream something, it means that it's the objectives of the mainstream development sector that are given priority, of education, of health, of agriculture, rather than of information technology. And this in turn requires greater contextualization, more attention to the development realities of the different countries, different communities, different localities involved. So you with me so far in terms of that sort of history? Yeah? So the third phase, from 2005 to date, I'd call a phase of impact. And this impact is rooted in the very rapid growth of mobile networks and services, which have transformed access to ICTs in Africa as elsewhere, and facilitated access to a range of developmental goods and services, not necessarily things that are called developmental, but which have that effect. So 20 years ago, hardly anyone in sub-Saharan Africa had a phone. Now almost every adult has one. And they're not just phones, they're multi-purpose digital devices, radios, cameras, personal organizers, internet access devices. In some countries, only a few, where mobile money's taken off, there are also wallets and debit cards. Now, this mobile-dominated ICT development was not what ICT4D advocates had expected. They'd actually been rather dismissive of mobile phones because they felt they did not have the potential to deliver what they saw as more important, that is, the internet. There are more than 230 references to the internet in the World Summit outcome documents. There's only one to the telephone, and that's to child helplines. And the World Bank maverick, Charles Kenny, who I think has now left the bank, when he persisted in arguing in the early years of the century that the phone was more important than the internet for the poor, was frequently lambasted by others in the development world for offering the poor something that was second-rate, the poorer choice. But it's mobile phones that have been the ICT of choice for developing country citizens, especially including the poor. So it's mobile phones that are accessible and affordable, that have met people's self-identified requirements, that have had significant impacts on lives and livelihoods in ways people have chosen to use them themselves. And it's mobile phones that have therefore provided the gateway to more advanced services, including the internet, and which now provide a platform for governments and development agencies to design and deliver programs that are realistically addressing genuine development objectives far more efficiently than, say, telecentres ever could. So I'd suggest two key lessons from this impact period. First, it's very difficult to predict the course of ICT technology and markets. So I don't blame ICT4D advocates for underestimating the mobile phone, though I think they can be blamed for underestimating the pace of change in the technology that was involved. And equally, as a corollary, and I think it's important to stress this, we would be equally at fault if we overestimated the importance of the mobile phone today and underestimated the potential impact of other platforms. And the second lesson is that the most effective ICT-enabled innovations are likely to be those that build on how people choose to use technology, rather than on the hopes or expectations of technologists and bureaucrats. So this suggests what Heeks calls a per-poor approach rather than a pro-poor approach, bottom-up rather than top-down approach to ICT4D. So in summary, here's what I think has happened in the last decade. I'm never sure if it's easy to interpret or not, but I understand what it means. So ICTs have evolved rapidly, and they've penetrated deeply into all societies. That's meant to be represented by that. And they've begun to have a pervasive influence on all aspects of society, economy and culture in developing countries as in industrial countries. Their development impact stems predominantly from adoption and use by citizens, businesses and organisations, not from ICT4D initiatives, those things in the middle. So I think development outcomes have emerged from citizen behaviour rather than government intervention. They're the result of what people have done with technology rather than what technology has done for them. But the pervasiveness of ICTs today has made it possible for governments and development agencies now to exploit the ICT environment much more effectively through strategies and programmes of the kind represented in the middle to gain social and economic developmental value. And that's led to renewed interest in ICT4D, especially in developing country governments, but also in the last 3 years or so from development agencies. I think ICT4D has been gathering more followers, though I still don't think it's mainstream. When I come to the end of this talk, I'll illustrate in particular why. So the implication for government and development agency policies of this is that they should emphasise the enabling environment, which is the yellow circle here, at least as much as the strategic applications which they seek to build on ICT investment. Put it another way, in this slide here, that the enabling environment is the foundation for both adoption and use of ICTs by citizens and the design and implementation of government-led ICT4D initiatives which can build on that adoption and use. And that enabling environment is something governments can readily influence through ICT policy and ICT regulation, something that justifies the importance that's been attached to regulation by the World Bank and other donors. So I'll say more about the pervasiveness of ICTs later when I come to the fourth phase, which is the future of ICT4D. But first I want to move on to something different, which is to question or qualify some of the core assumptions of ICT4D thinking, which I think are problematic. Shall I move straight on to that, or does anyone want to raise anything at that particular point quickly? Okay. Okay, so the four assumptions I want to question or qualify concern the nature of the impact which information technology can be expected to have on social and economic development. And I'm not suggesting here that they don't have such an impact. On the contrary, that's not what I think at all. What I think is problematic with these four assumptions is that they've pushed ICT4D advocates towards policy approaches which make them less effective in leveraging the value of ICTs than they otherwise would be. So, assumption number one is that ICT investment leads to macroeconomic growth in the relatively short term. And this is an argument that was first sponsored by Waverman and others, funded by Vodafone in 2002 in respect of mobile phones, and more recently in respect of broadband by Christine Chang and others, sponsored by the World Bank. Both of these use data from industrialised countries before and during ICT investment back to 1980 to claim that investment's had a short-term impact on GDP growth rates, and they've suggested that impact on GDP growth rates will be stronger in developing countries than it's been in industrial countries. So these studies are widely cited in ICT and development literature, but I think they're open to serious question. First, there are some methodological problems in them. They use data series which stretch back well before relevant investment began. I think if you looked at more recent industrial country data, say from 2007 onwards, you wouldn't be able to demonstrate a comparable positive association between broadband investment and GDP growth, not least because there hasn't been any GDP growth in industrial countries in that period. Second, they don't adequately address the probability of reverse causality, the likelihood that it's societies which are experiencing economic growth that can invest more rapidly in infrastructure rather than the other way about. Third, they ignore the time interval required for investment impacts to feed through to macroeconomic indicators. And in the case of earlier generations of IT investment, of computerization in the 80s and 90s, this was around 5 years. And finally, they presuppose that developing countries which are late in adopting a technology will experience the same outcomes as industrial countries adopting it much earlier, which seems to me unlikely, firstly because of their different circumstances, but also simply because they're coming later to the party and so seeking to exploit broadband when other countries already have it. So, don't get me wrong about this, I do think that broadband networks are likely to lead to positive macroeconomic outcomes, as well as other benefits over time. I just don't think they'll be as soon or as uniform as this argument supposes. And if that argument is wrong, it's likely to lead to suboptimal investment and development choices being made, which is why it's a problem. So my questionable assumption number 2 is that ICTs are best deployed in addressing basic needs and poverty reduction. Development community built its global strategy in 2000 around the Millennium Development Goals. And ICT4D advocates have tried to demonstrate that their technology will have a major impact on those goals. The Broadband Commission has been arguing, has published at length about ways in which it believes ICTs can benefit the goals, and indeed has argued that they're especially relevant to them. Now again, of course there are ways in which ICTs can contribute to basic needs and poverty reduction, but they're not in practice the most obvious or effective ways of tackling basic needs. If you want to target malaria, as in MDG 6, bed nets are going to have more impact than any technology is going to have. If you want to reduce maternal mortality, as in MDG 5, clean places to give birth and better trained midwives are going to have more effect than mobile phones or laptops. And this is well understood by mainstream development professionals on one side of that cartoon that I showed earlier. In fact, I'd suggest that rather than being specially relevant to basic needs and poverty reduction, ICTs have more inherent value in other areas of development. Think about why ICTs have a developmental value in the first place, and I'd say that's for 4 reasons. They enable things to be done more efficiently, they enable them to be done more collaboratively, they enable access to more information, and they facilitate innovation, in other words, doing things which were not previously feasible. As a result of that, I think they are likely to make a bigger difference to the capabilities of people and organisations which have more social, economic and other assets than they are to the poor and marginalised. Now, it doesn't make them wrong or bad, it just means what they can achieve is different. So if that's so, more attention should be focused in ICT4D not on poverty, but on impacts at a societal level, on enterprise development and innovation, on the revitalisation and modernisation of large-scale economic sectors, on improving government performance, on tackling urbanisation, monitoring environmental change, and so forth. And there shouldn't be any shame in focusing on these big picture development issues. Development doesn't consist solely of poverty reduction. So I think ICT4D advocates shouldn't feel obliged to emphasise the contribution to poverty reduction in order to make the technology seem more important. And my assumption number 3 is that ICTs are necessarily benign and necessarily empowering. I don't think that's true at all. New technology does empower people, but it empowers people in many ways and for many different purposes. It also threatens privacy, enables the surveillance state. Technology can enhance public services and encourage political engagement, but it also facilitates new forms of exploitation and crime. Automation speeds up processes and lowers costs in economic sectors, but also threatens jobs. ICTs can help to mitigate climate change, but they're also the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions and of physical waste. So all of these are balances which are important to bear in mind, and I think in developing countries they pose particular questions about inclusion and marginalisation. ICTs are more widely available in urban areas than rural areas, and those who live in rural areas are rarely asked their views about ICTs and policy discussions around them. And while more information is valuable to all, including the poor, as I've kind of already suggested, the greatest beneficiaries of increased information resources are likely to be the better off and the better educated. People who can easily use those resources to enhance their social and economic standing at the expense of others. In other words, ICTs may not be empowering, they may be disempowering, they may increase rather than reduce marginalisation. So as examples, much is said about the use of mobile money in Kenya, though it's been difficult to replicate elsewhere. But mobile money is of no benefit to people who have no money in the first place. A lot is said about the value to farmers of the ability to access market prices through their mobile phones. But the poorest farmers don't have any surplus produce to sell. And it's consumer prices rather than producer prices that matter most to those who are most marginalised. So we need to acknowledge and address these problems and complexities of the information society, as well as leveraging opportunities. And that's more than a matter of access, content and affordability. I think addressing those kind of digital disadvantages and ensuring that ICTs do not exacerbate inequalities requires them to be properly integrated into national development policy making, with clear thought given to how they can best contribute to an overall development strategy. And this is, I'll come back to this, not always been the case. And assumption number 4, which sort of stems from these, is that the digital divide can be overcome. So ever since the Maitland Commission, ICT4D advocates have prioritised bridging the digital divide, enabling everyone to benefit from the technology that's available. Well, the problem with this is that technology is not static. Every week there are new devices, new services, new technologies, new things you can do which build on the endless growth and capacity of digital components that we've seen over recent years. And these technologies and devices and services will always be bought first by those who have the money to pay for them and the skills to make use of them. So by the better off and the better educated. They'll be adopted and used in richer countries and by richer people before they're adopted and used in poorer countries and by poorer people. That's just how innovation markets work. The only way to stop that happening and end the digital divide would be a moratorium on innovation. So the issue that matters for me is not the existence of a digital divide, which can't be bridged so long as innovation continues to drive new products and services. The issue that matters is the length of time it takes for late adopters to catch up with early adopters. That's what will decide whether the digital divide exacerbates other development divides in health, education, productivity and so forth within countries or between them. So it's a time gap we should be concentrating on, not a quantity gap in access. And I'll come back to the digital divide a bit later. The other thing that I wanted to mention around the kind of this sort of area is to say something about national strategies for ICT4D. The World Summit advocated these. UN agencies have also been keen on them, especially UNECA in Africa. Most developing countries probably now have some form of national ICT strategy. And I'm not against strategies in any sense. I think they're actually fundamentally necessary. But there have been 3 major flaws in those that have been deployed. So these 3 flaws here. And my first flaw is that they've been highly aspirational. Like ICT4D in general, they've focused on what ICTs could do in ideal circumstances. They've done insufficient discounting for the economic, social and infrastructure realities of the developing country context that they are meant to apply within. So a government like Rwanda's, which has put ICTs at the centre of its national development strategy, has had to acknowledge that it underestimated the problems, tried to do too much at once, anticipated far greater achievements than could actually be managed in real circumstances. Many strategies have had grossly inadequate institutional frameworks for delivery. They paid far too little attention to financial requirements, capacity development, or the weaknesses of infrastructure. Have been built on hope rather than reality. The second point here is that many strategies have been insufficiently integrated with overall national development plans. They've been designed by external consultants, usually ICT specialists, often cutting and pasting from strategies they did for somewhere else beforehand. And too little attention by far has been paid to countries' individual circumstances or the real requirements of mainstream development sectors. As a result, professionals in other development sectors, like education or health or agriculture or enterprise development, whose fields are supposed to benefit from this, have been insufficiently involved in their design. And with those professionals being uncommitted to these strategies and unconsulted about them, they're unlikely to be enthusiastic about implementing them, especially when they divert financial resources away from the things that they would themselves have prioritised. So we're back there to sustaining that paradigm gap between the ICT and mainstream development professionals. And third, I think the strategies have been insufficiently adaptive. ICTs change very rapidly, so the viable lifetime for any strategy for their deployment in development is very limited. Remember the mobile phones, ignored in the World Summit, development darlings by 2010. I think ICT4D experience is littered with legacy technology and with approaches to service delivery which have quickly lost their relevance, of which the telecentre is again symbolic. The most important thing, it seems to me, for any ICT4D strategy to recognise is obsolescence, its obsolescence. So strategies that lock governments into particular technology or development approaches will fail because they're unresponsive to changes in technology and markets and people's behaviour. Successful strategies will be adaptive. They'll go with the flow of technology, markets and behaviour rather than trying to impose static solutions. So in the remainder of what I want to say, a little less than a half I think, I'll move on to the second, the final phase in my four-phase history of ICT4D, which is the future, which I call information society. And I'll approach this from two angles. Through the work I've been doing on ICTs and sustainability for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and through work on the impact of emerging technologies, which I've been doing for CSTD. So recently I've looked in some depth at the relationship between ICTs and sustainability. And this is important because the concept of sustainable development, which emerged in the 80s, is set to be the starting point for the post-2015 development agenda. So, sustainable development relies on a synergistic and balanced approach to three things: to economic prosperity, social equity, and environmental sustainability. It takes the view, which is ultimately an optimistic view, that these three objectives can be pursued together rather than through trade-offs between them. Now, I'm personally not, as it happens, an optimist about this. I think that's a very difficult trick to pull off, sustainable development, but there we go. It doesn't mean to say that the aim is not worth pursuing, though, and not worth having as the central aim of the post-2015 agenda. It's certainly better than most alternatives. One thing that it implies, though, is this: if the nature of economy, society, and culture change substantially as a result of ICTs or anything else, then we need to revisit our understanding of what sustainability means and how it can be achieved. So the study that we did was aimed to ask this question: has the pervasiveness of ICTs had such an impact on society that we need to rethink the meaning of sustainability? And our conclusion was that ICTs have indeed profoundly affected underlying characteristics of economy, society and culture in ways that alter the opportunities and challenges and threats to sustainability. However, this has happened largely beneath the radar. It's not been factored into mainstream thinking about either development or sustainability. So I obviously don't have time to go into detail into many of the changes that have taken place, and a few of them are listed on the right-hand side of this slide, and I'll elaborate briefly. So they include, what we mean here are, for example, disruptive changes in production, distribution and consumption of goods and services, emergence of new economic sectors and business models, including both legitimate and criminal models, the appearance of extremely powerful global corporations which are largely independent of national and international regulation. Google, I'm talking about you. Changes in work and leisure patterns, in the nature and delivery of public services, in the way in which financial flows occur, in the structure and diversity of human settlements. All of these are substantially affected by the ways in which people respond to, and businesses and organisations respond to, the changes that have taken place in communications. And then there's the transition from scarcity to abundance and scarcity to ubiquity in access to information, which has had impacts on behavioural norms, on knowledge sharing, on the exercise of expression. There are changes in relationships amongst individuals and within communities, for example, between diasporas and their source communities. Changes in the relationships between citizens and governments, some of which empower citizens, some of which empower governments. Changes in the capacity and competence of government, the range of things that it can actually achieve. Not to mention the impact of ICTs on environmental sustainability because of its impact on greenhouse gas emissions and physical waste. So all of these changes are more prominent in industrial countries, obviously, but they're also visible and increasingly visible, and in some cases highly visible, in developing countries, most of which, of course, are middle-income countries, not impoverished or marginalised LDCs. And it's not the individual impact of these changes that we saw as being significant so much as their totality. It's together that they are having a profound systemic and structural impact on society, economy and culture, which we argue in our study represents the emergence of what we could call an information society. Most importantly, these changes will continue and accelerate over the next 10 years. That is the period of the post-2015 development agenda. So an aside on Moore's law. We often take Moore's law for granted, or we have done, and we should think more about its implications here, looking back. I'll say something about looking forward in a minute. So the doubling of ICT components capacity every 2 years or so has been ongoing for a long period of time. If you take Moore's basic assessment of that, the Moore's Law basic assessment of that, they're more than 30 times greater than they were at the time of WSIS 10 years ago. So it's that near exponential growth in capabilities which has made possible the rapid substantial impacts on economy, society and culture that I've described. Now, there's a debate at the moment about whether Moore's Law is over, or at least abating, and I'm sure that people here are better placed than me to make a judgment of that. If it's not abating, the capabilities of computing and communications in 2025 would be more than 1,000 times greater than they were in 2005, which is a scenario that David Cleaveley used to demonstrate in diagrams like this. Even if the rate of growth in the capacity of computing and communications is much more modest than this, they will still be growing at a phenomenal pace compared with what we experienced at the time of the World Summit. And human behaviour and institutions, laws and regulations can't absorb that pace of change indefinitely. I think we see problems with that already in European countries. It's particularly difficult for institutions, governments, citizens, businesses in developing countries to absorb that pace of change. So I wouldn't celebrate Moore's Law, whether it's abating or not. I'm raising it to illustrate why those who are concerned with the post-2015 development agenda need to pay more attention to these underlying changes in society and to the long-term impact which ICTs are having on the structure of how societies and economies actually work. They need to pay more attention, in other words, to the subliminal changes in society and economy that have emerged over the past decade, rather than focusing so much on the opportunities of government or agency-led initiatives. And I think they should pay as much attention to the problems of the information society as to its opportunities. So that's one side of that. I'll move on now to the work I've been doing for CSTD on the potential impact of emerging technology trends. So the WSIS outcome documents were very poor at anticipating the pace of change that's taken place since then. As I said earlier, they failed to realise the importance of mobile phones. In fact, CSTD's 5-year review of WSIS outcomes identified 5 major changes in the ICT landscape between 2005 and 2010, which weren't anticipated at the summit, and they're the 5 on here. So mass market mobile telephony, the development of smartphones, mobile apps and the mobile internet, the emergence of the interactive web, including social networking, rapid investment in broadband, and the emergence of cloud computing. And that 5-year review of WSIS outcomes argued that these trends required substantial changes in thinking about ICTs and development from the assumptions made in 2003 or 2005. the public policy towards ICT4D should no longer base itself on what WSIS had thought, but should base itself on the changed circumstances which have now emerged, the impact of these new developments, ways of expediting their beneficial outcomes and mitigating their potential harms. So last year, CSTD asked me to revisit that approach and identify 5 emerging trends which could form the basis for thinking about ICT4D in the post-2015 development agenda. And I don't think there's anything particularly surprising in the 5 I chose, which were datafication in government and business, big data and related processes, including open data, crowdsourcing and social media analytics, cloud computing again, the Internet of Things and smart systems, the use of ICTs to manage power generation, logistics, construction and other industrial sectors. So I'll comment on 2 of these and their implications for developing countries to illustrate the complexities involved and the changes in thinking that may need to follow, which perhaps are at least as significant as those in the 5 previous trends. So first, cloud computing, which is the subject of that UNCTAD Information Economy report, which I also worked last year. As you know, cloud computing enables users to locate data and applications in data centers, so to rent access to them as and when required, rather than hosting them on their own devices. So for businesses and governments, this offers savings in hardware, software and IT management costs, which might represent up to 40% of IT expenditure. Though obviously that depends a lot on the quality and reliability of communications networks. The big cloud providers like Google and Amazon are heavily promoting cloud solutions to developing countries. They're arguing that best value will be obtained by using their mega clusters of data centers, which offer maximum economies of scale. So what's the problem? Well, firstly, especially since PRISM, governments and businesses are concerned about data sovereignty. So their data may be secure from criminals in the cloud, but not from foreign governments. Secondly, they're wary of dependence on the global cloud providers. So the government of Kenya, for example, is building its own data centers, not so much because it's scared of PRISM, but because it doesn't want to be dependent on Google and Amazon. Foregoing economies of scale that could be achieved by using global cloud providers, and it will offer capacity on its own data centers to local businesses. I think most importantly, most developing countries don't have the infrastructure needed to enable the cloud to deliver all that the cloud providers promise. So it requires high quality, reliable broadband networks with high redundancy, with low latency, with low communications costs. And it also requires enabling legislation for data protection and cybersecurity and electronic transactions, which often is not in place. So UNCTAD has identified some opportunities for developing countries in that report. That post-PRISM paranoia, for example, could lead to more national rather than global clouds along the Kenyan lines, scope for local businesses to offer new information and transaction services, or to be cloud brokers and aggregators. So if, and as the cloud becomes the norm, we should expect developing country businesses to exploit it in much the same way as they've exploited mobile phones, the internet and social networks. It should alter technology and markets and behaviour, much as earlier ICTs have done. However, until those infrastructure challenges are dealt with, the cloud economy is likely to take off more slowly in developing countries, especially lower income countries, and it could make it more difficult to build national ICT sectors. Broadly, conclusions from that report. I'll take big data as a second example, because it's been commended by the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda. It's virtually the only ICT-related activity that makes it into that high-level panel report. So big data is touted as a valuable development tool, and its value, it seems to me, lies not so much in the availability of specific data sets, but in the ability to analyse and correlate multiple diverse data sets in ways that couldn't previously be done. That's what enables governments potentially to understand societies in greater depth, improve the quality of policy making, enable more effective modelling of policy and programme choices. And there's certainly considerable potential value there. It could represent a step change in the information dynamic in development. We should expect it to become more widespread, though again more slowly than in industrial countries. But a couple of points about that. First, big data is dependent on the quality of data gathering and the quality of analysis, which is feasible on that data. So data gathering in most developing countries is very poor. Relevant skills are in short supply. More data is not necessarily better if there's no capacity to analyse it. Actually, it can obscure analysis. It can certainly be used as a way of excluding inconveniences like citizen engagement from policy-making processes. And then second, the best information and analysis in the world have got little value unless there are human, financial and institutional resources to do something with the outcomes. And it's these human, financial and institutional resources that ultimately make ICT-enabled development interventions possible. Many least developed countries simply don't have them. And thirdly, it's important to remember that big data aren't entirely benign. So if you listen to advocates of social media analytics, they'll tell you how easy it will be to pinpoint influenza hotspots and allow medical facilities to be targeted on those areas. Well, who could find anything possibly amiss about that? But it isn't influenza that Bashar Assad will be targeting through social media analytics, is it? Imagine what the Interahamwe could have done in Rwanda in 1994 if they had access to mobile phones and Twitter accounts and social media analytics. And I think this here lies the basic critique of ICT4D. ICTs can do marvels, but only in the right conditions. To understand what they can achieve and what they will achieve, can and will being very different things, they have to be understood within the context of a time and place, and within the context of financial, infrastructural, human capacity and political constraints that surround them. So all 5 of the emerging trends on that particular slide are highly dependent on other factors if they are to lead to developmental outcomes. Do countries have the necessary communications networks, in particular broadband networks? Do they have people who can manage them or design appropriate policies and programs? Do they have the human and institutional capabilities to implement those programs? Do they have the financial resources for capital and operational expenditure? So the potential of impact of these emerging trends is therefore conditional. It's a human development challenge as much as a technological development challenge. And resources need to be put into closing that gap in understanding between the human and technological dimensions. I'd suggest the next wave of ICT-enabled changes coming from these particular things here is going to be especially dependent on quality of communications infrastructure, which is available within developing countries. So these trends need widespread, high-quality, reliable broadband infrastructure. They need, as well as that infrastructure, they need soft systems. They need the legal and regulatory frameworks for electronic transactions and data protection. They need a high standard of cyber security. They need financial services which are prepared to run new types of transactions. They need a climate of business regulation that facilitates innovation. And as a result of that, I think, as things stand, the benefits from cloud computing will be lower for developing countries, of cloud computing and these other things will be lower for developing countries, because those capabilities are not as present within them, and they'll be particularly lower for low-income developing countries. So what impact does it have on the digital divide, to return to that? Well, we've had a decade in which concern about the digital divide has been declining because the gap in basic access and use of ICTs has been narrowing thanks to mobile phones. But the gap in broadband access and use has grown over that same period, and that's put the digital divide back at the top of many people's agendas in this field. So if broadband investment is associated with economic growth, if it is, then the growing broadband divide is likely to exacerbate other development gaps between richer and poorer countries. I've already given my critique of ICT4D's preoccupation with the development divide, and I won't go back to that again, but essentially I think that the issue here that matters is not so much the quantity of the gap as the time delay between adoption in early adopting and late adopting countries. My own view, looking at current trends, is that middle-income developing countries are likely to catch up with industrial countries in the medium term. But the gap between middle-income countries and least developed countries is likely to grow. So I think there's a high risk that LDCs will be left behind in a lasting digital divide, and that will have impacts on other development divides, which is a challenge for development policymakers as a whole, not just those who are concerned with ICTs. The governments, it has obvious implications for government policy. Governments that address the physical and regulatory infrastructure issues that I mentioned, from broadband infrastructure deployment to the business regulatory environment, those will have significantly better prospects of keeping up with the majority of countries as they leverage advantages from these new trends. And development agencies, I think, ought to recognise that when they're considering investment strategies. So I'll summarise my overall view and then say something about of the trajectory of ICT4D, and then say something about the post-2015 development agenda. First, ICTs have had profound systemic and structural impacts on economy, society and culture, which I describe as the emergence of an information society. I like that term again. I didn't for a while, but I like it again. It's therefore ICTs themselves, rather than government or donor interventions, that have had most impact on development outcomes so far, and it's ICTs themselves, rather than those interventions, which provide the most appropriate platform for us to think about future ICT4D. The emphasis of government policy should be on the enabling environment, at least as much as on government-led programs. Second, the pace of change in ICT technology and markets will continue to be very rapid. And the impact of ICTs on economy, society and culture, that subliminal impact I talked about earlier, will also continue to grow rapidly and will be difficult to predict. So we can be pretty sure that today's emerging trends, up there, will seem old hat in 2020, let alone 5 or 10 years later when the post-2015 development agenda is completing its timeline. So we'll be looking then very different trends. I've suggested some of those on that slide there. But that's, I'm not an expert here. The point I'm trying to make is that the trends that matter will continually change, and in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, we'll be exploring an entirely different set of trends in whatever CSTD is doing to evaluate the trajectory of ICTs then. So there's clearly considerable potential for governments to leverage adoption and use of ICTs to achieve development goals, but infrastructure and good intentions aren't enough, and nor are top-down programs. It's a human development challenge, and my prescription for the next phase of ICT would therefore be built around 3 points. Rather than mainstreaming ICTs in social and economic development activities, it should recognise that they're already deeply entrenched in society and economy. Rather than self-consciously including ICTs in development programs, it should work with the choices that have been made by target beneficiaries. Rather than locking programs into today's technologies, it should ensure they're open to tomorrow's, so more adaptive to rapidly changing circumstances than it's been so far. So I want to finish with a few words about the post-2015 development agenda, which I also come to from work for CSTD, which is trying to focus its priorities for science, technology and innovation in this new development era. So I'll briefly summarise what's happening. The UN General Assembly will agree a post-2015 development agenda next year at the end point of the Millennium Development Goals timeframe, 2015. The process of developing this will merge with a separate process which follows on from the Rio +20 Earth Summit, which will culminate in the adoption of Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. These SDGs are intended to move away from the concentration on poverty reduction and basic needs that there was in the Millennium Development Goals towards more holistic societal development goals. And then also in 2015, the General Assembly will review the outcomes of the World Summit 10 years on. If we're really unlucky, it will do that through another global summit, but hopefully it will do it through a high-level review process of some kind. So where will ICT4D fit into this post-2015 agenda? Now, given the underlying systemic societal changes that I'm arguing have resulted from ICTs in the last 20 years, you might expect them to feature prominently in these discussions. But at present, that isn't happening. And I think the paradigm gap that I identified earlier between ICT4D thinking and mainstream development thinking is still around and still influential. So the outcome document for the Rio +20 Earth Summit, which is called The Future We Want, had almost nothing to say about information technology and nothing at all about the systemic and structural changes that I've talked about resulting from the emergence of an information society. It merely mentioned a few ways in which some IT tools could help with environmental monitoring, information sharing, and things like that. There's actually more about tourism in the future we want than there is about information technology, the information revolution. Although ironically, as my colleague who was sitting in the meeting pointed out, during the negotiations it was very hard to get delegates to take their eyes away from their laptops. Second, the high-level panel, which was set up by the United Nations to start the discussions on the post-2015 agenda. This was a panel that was co-chaired by David Cameron. It does give a nod in favour of big data, quite an important nod in favour of big data, which it sees as enabling better development policy making, planning and implementation. But it's got nothing to say about the systemic or structural impact which ICTs have had to date, or, and I think this is more important, about the much more substantial structural and systemic impacts that ICTs are likely to have over the 15 years that the SDGs play out until 2030. None of the early drafts for the SDGs includes ICT access or use. So I'm thinking here in particular of those in the high-level panel report, or in the action agenda for sustainable development, which comes from Jeffrey Sachs's Sustainable Development Solutions Network. There's under consultation at the moment, and I've illustrated them here. So although this doesn't mention ICTs, I think it's evident that ICTs will have more impact on the prospects of achieving those goals than ICTs have had on achieving the Millennium Development Goals of the previous generation. So I end by a kind of view on this. I'm much less sanguine, I think, about the acknowledgement of ICTs in this post-2015 development agenda process than Richard Heeks would be, and he was here commenting a few weeks ago. Myself, I've never been a cheerleader for ICT4D. I've always tended to play down its potential, sort of pour water on the excitable enthusiasms of the evangelists. But I am more than disappointed at the absence of an understanding of ICTs and their impact in these early discussions about the post-2015 agenda, their impact, their present impact and their future impact, and in particular about the underlying changes in the nature of society and economy. I actually find it rather disturbing. And what worries me is that while the potential of the information society flattered to deceive in the decade leading up to the World Summit, the reality of an emergent information society is now being underestimated by the development community. So I think those of us who are concerned about ICTs and development need to find ways of ensuring that it gets the attention it merits today. And unless we do that, there's a risk that opportunities, challenges and threats to development will be missed in the period of the SDGs between 2015 and 2030. Not just that, but that the SDGs will fail to pay sufficient attention or take sufficient notice of the way in which the structure of society is being changed by information technology. So that's where I'd end. I will dehydrate it.
Thank you.
And I did talk for an hour, so I apologise if that was too long.
I think that was exactly an hour. Thanks a lot. That was very insightful. I have, I don't know, I think 6, 7 questions, but I want to leave the floor to you first, and then I go at the end, if that's okay. Questions for David?
Do you need another glass of water?
Oh, yes, please. Thanks. Yeah.
You mentioned the word context a few times when we were discussing the word context actually means in ICT4D today. And what you said is that there's a lack of awareness of context, which has led to several projects to fail, or at least not to be as successful. But are you aware of people who study these contexts before these projects are initiated? Are they technology impact assessors? And if these people do exist, are they not doing their job well, or what are they missing? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
Well, there should be, but I mean, I think in the early days, in particular, thanks, ICT4D enthusiasts leapt in, saying, you know, here, like that quote from the World Bank, you know, here is the magic solution. That was, I kind of suspect that you had, you know, we've had 50 years of development policy in which there have been different approaches adopted by international development agencies, and the gains have not been as great as had been wished. And so there's a desire always to find the magic bullet, the thing that's been missed, the new thing that could make a big difference. And ICT4D advocates in those early days thought they'd found that magic bullet. And so were very uncritical in the way in which they advanced it. So they didn't do the assessments which should always be there at the start of any process, any policy process, let alone any development program process, of analysing the society, the context in which it's going to be placed. Initially, of course, a lot of it was pilot projects, but I mean, there was a lot of enthusiasm based around this, and I think still most developing countries and most strategies, ICT for development strategies, do not start from a sufficient research base. So there's insufficient analysis done of what was at one time called e-readiness, but I mean the ICT environment, but also of the social, economic and political environment and the likely changes that are to result. I can give a kind of example of the pressures that as a consultant you come under here. So I was doing a study, in fact, for the World Bank and the African Development Bank of education, ICTs and education in Africa with some colleagues, and this was put out to peer review. And one of the peer review organisations, which is an ICT company, came back and said, well, why haven't you advocated the use of electronic whiteboards in sub-Saharan Africa? And you know, sort of, where do you start? Average expenditure per pupil in sub-Saharan African primary schools after teachers' salaries is between $5 and $10 a year. Would be one place to start, or the power supply, or whatever. And I'm just trying to illustrate the kind of the failure to understand the realities of life in rural Burkina.
Okay. Right. Can I ask a follow-up? Is it what is the failure? Is it people trying to push their own products, or is it literally a lack of understanding that the world in Africa is different than the world in Europe?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily different. I mean, it's continuum, actually. I mean, it's not a sort of Africa's there and the rest of the world's here. It's all, on the part of the ICT4D advocates, it's a desire to push their technology because they really believe in it. I mean, I think it's as simple as that. Gradually, obviously, that has improved, and there is much more understanding now of the need to contextualise, and I don't think you get those sort of problems in quite the same scale any longer. On the part of governments, it's very often political pressures within government. You know, so why has Rwanda invested so much in information technology as the core of its national development policy because Paul Kagame wanted to. There are very often quite deep political tensions there. But I think that mainstream development ministries have often been quite weak in resisting the kind of the pull of new technology or the appeal of that. And ministries of finance and development planning, which are the ones that should be making the judgments, haven't gone into sufficient analysis and have been pushed and pulled by lobbying and pressure from within political systems, and to some extent business lobbying as well, rather than doing the sort of, rather than properly integrating international development strategies in the way they should have done.
I maybe can follow up with one question about this, the discourse problem that Ben was referring to. So do you think that those studies, as an example, that overestimated or just made assumptions about the macroeconomic impact? I think in the recent GSMA report on the knowledge economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, or the impact of mobile in Sub-Saharan Africa, they're projecting something like 8% now in Sub-Saharan Africa, that the contribution of mobile technologies is 8% to GDP. So that seems that, the same kind of problematic assumptions are still being made. Do you think there has been a realization that assumptions are being made too easily, that it's more complex, that you need to have that bridge to the human development agenda? Has there been more of this realization, or is it actually still the case that all these false assumptions are being made?
GSMA publishes some interesting stuff, but it's not the obvious source for an unbiased opinion on the importance of mobile phones.
Exactly right.
I mean, my starting point for all of this was work I did for the OECD about 12 years ago, I think, on the Solow paradox and its implications for developing countries. So the Solow paradox was the observation that Robert Solow, a Nobel-winning economist, made about computerization in the United States. The quote is, "You can see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics." So why can't you see the impact of IT investment coming through in macroeconomic outcomes and so on? And the OECD's analysis of that was effectively to say that, well, there are a number of factors that are relevant here, some of which are to do with economic structures and so forth, but basically it takes a while, for somebody's investment in information technology to change the way in which processes are occurring and to have an impact on society as a whole. And so when you get a study which says there is in effect an almost instant association between technology and GDP growth rates, you should start from a position of great skepticism about that association. What you should be seeing, if there is an association between them, is one that is gradually built up over a period of time, not something that is as dramatic as that. I think I don't. While they're heavily promoted in the literature, when I talk to people in the field, I don't come across anyone who really believes those two studies. I think the basic methodological criticism is they're starting with data from 1980. Well, there wasn't any broadband in 1980. So you're starting from a particular point when actually you're getting false measurement. Sorry, I've kind of drifted away from the kind of main point about it.
The ICT advocates actually say, do more studies like that. That gave us some ammunition. So, and I think my question was more getting at, is that we need ammunition to drive this agenda, no matter if it's really true. Is that still going on, or is there more for realization?
No, I think there is still quite a lot of that.
Right.
I think, there are very powerful organizations and companies within the ICT sector who are very keen indeed to promote their technology as a developmental solution for commercial reasons, as well as probably because they believe in it. And yes, I think that is evident in the Broadband Commission, apart from anywhere else. The Broadband Commission is asserting the value of broadband in development, which, broadly speaking, I think is absolutely right. But it's not seeking sufficiently to demonstrate it because it doesn't, and it's not looking critically enough at evidence. And and the particular set of issues I would like to see more done on is around least developed countries and late adopters. I don't see it as very likely that a late adopting LDC is going to achieve anything like the sort of gains across its economy that an early adopting middle income country achieves. So I think that kind of disaggregation of developing countries is really important and is not being sufficiently done. But there's certainly a lot of stuff out there which is about still saying, our stuff's magic and it does great things. What they will be, I know not, but they will be the terrors of the earth, as King Lear put it.
So you were talking about some different strategies that you kind of advocated around infrastructure, legal framework, business regulation, and also in this idea of these new emerging trends that we should talk about. Isn't this a kind of a rather purely economic focus on ICT use? And are we missing out on some kind of, these kind of angles is just going to increase kind of unevenness in society? So is there room in this for some kind of more equitable idea of society through ICT, or are we just abandoning it?
Well, no, I think the purpose of development policy is obviously to address those questions of inequalities and marginalisation and inclusiveness and so on. So, those are development policy objectives. Do ICTs inherently move societies in more inclusive or less inclusive directions? Actually, I've always rather felt that the natural tendency is for information technology to increase inequalities and rather than to decrease it. For the reason I was saying halfway through, that the people who adopt something new are the people who can afford to adopt something new and have the skills. So the better off and the better educated can increase the difference between themselves and the less well off and less well educated. I think that seems to me to be the natural way that things are likely to go, but there are countervailing tendencies. So if the cost of access to information, for example, becomes much lower, then the tendency will be to be more inclusive and to reduce those inequalities. But the sort of notion that ICTs are inherently inclusive and benign and empowering seems to me to come from the aspirational vision rather than the observable phenomenon side of looking at the information society. It's what people wanted to happen, because wouldn't it be nice if it did?
But isn't it the shape of the policies which define how the ICTs are useful or not? So if you're advocating a very strong market policy, then it's not going to be inclusive. But if we push maybe towards some other angles, thinking about how it could be more beneficial, then it could potentially be more positive.
Well, I think governments can influence those outcomes through policy and regulatory frameworks, which is why I have that yellow circle on that diagram there. That this interface here is a kind of pressure point in which the ICT policymakers can interface with those who are thinking about general development policy and the application of ICTs in development. And in this space here, you can have some impacts, some effects which make these outcomes more or less developmental, more or less inclusive, and so forth. Yes, I think that there is scope for that. but it's not necessarily what governments choose to do, of course. And I do think that, I mean, I would go back to the basic point. I think that it's the ICTs that are more important than the government programs. That ICT for development is ICT in development has been an outcome of how people have used ICTs more than it has been an outcome of how governments have used ICTs. Yeah.
Or is maybe there is a more conspiratorial answer to that? And last week we had Dan McKillen, who gave us this postmodern, anti-capitalist kind of view of the information society. And he said something that is obvious, but it resonates with what you're saying. It's like there are inequalities out there. And of course, and this resonates with what you say, when there is a new technology coming out there, there is going to be the rich benefiting from it, and then it will end up being used by others later in time. But you can say the same thing for so many other issues. For example, there can be an access to information law that in theory benefits everybody, but in a very neoliberal, unequal system, it's going to be those with the resources to have access to information that will use lawyers, the journalists, and not the citizen. Or you have the open data as well, which in theory is empowering everybody, and it has this very strong emphasis and narrative about this is for the citizen, and the citizen can finally hold governments accountable. But that's
The
rubbish.
principal beneficiaries are the companies who don't need to do as much market research on their own. Yeah.
So isn't that, as I said, it's conspiratorial in a way, and it's provocative, but it's intrinsic. So there is a way, there is a narrative building out there about innovation being inclusive, but at the same time, if we really look with the eyes open at what is going on, it can't be. So we have the structural, to be Marxian, the structural aspect of it, which is extremely unequal, and it's very clear. And then we have a narrative built on top of it that says the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people believe in the narrative and don't look at the structural aspect of it.
I don't think this is an either or. You can have both of those processes
Sure.
happening simultaneously, and it's the interleaving of them that's uncertain, that has uncertain outcomes. And I'm not sure it's terribly easy for any particular actors to try and influence how the relationship between those two, or what happens as a result of the relationship between those two. I mean, certainly ICT4D is an attempt to make that outcome more inclusive, I would say.
But should ICT4D be more radical in what it's doing? Because it seems that, in so long, as you were saying, and you've been around for a very long time, it seems that there was some revolutionary, aspirational, and that was good at the same time. It wasn't just bad. Of course, it can be criticized, but it seems that has lost its steam as much as Californian dream of an internet for everybody has. And shouldn't we be more radical in that, and not just going with the flow and say, oh well?
Well, one thing I didn't try to cover was whether the term ICT4D was useful, and I haven't, well, partly because I haven't actually yet reached a conclusion on that. But I mean, we don't have pharmacology for development in the same way, do we? We don't have nanotechnology for development. We don't have nuclear physics for development. So why do we have ICT for development? I think it's a construct of people who wished to create this nice domain for themselves, which they could use, some of them within the sector, some of them within a development world. So I'm a bit uncertain as to whether actually having a sort of thing called ICT for development is awfully helpful in itself. Sorry.
No, I'm just saying, it's again, aspirational can be a great thing. Sometimes we are too self-critical and looking at our mistakes. We can also turn the same criticism on his head and say we should have been more aggressive. And someone has created ICT4D. We should have said earlier on that was a very bad decision.
What would be your radical objective for it?
That's a good question. But unfortunately, I see, and I want to turn into a two-way discussion, certain governments, like the Rwandan government, sometimes being more radical than other governments, and saying we are taking in our hands, we are of course, these are other technologies that they're not going to be plastic bags in the country, and we enforce it as much as we take control of our infrastructure. Mark knows more than I do about this, and we try to turn certain movement towards an unequal information society into state-driven, increasingly equal information society where we are in control. We go against certain dynamics, and I'm not saying that is my example of radical. I'm not in love with Paul Kagame, but he has some original ideas that sometimes are more original than the same things, so sort of reuse. I know. I'm sorry that I was showing something to Mark before, but what I was showing was this, and was yet another mosaic with a mobile phone to show that there is innovation. Come on, we are not doing well enough. We're sort of rehearsing the same things over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what? Just think of Rwanda for a second, right? Why did the government of Rwanda, which is essentially one person, decide to major on ICTs as a within its national development strategy, for which, of course, it got very much praised within the ICT4D community, and Kagame co-chairs the Broadband Commission and so forth. But the reason that was given at the time, and seems to me to make entire sense, is that Kagame's movement looked at Rwanda's prospects as a low-income country recovering from 20 years of genocidal civil war in Central Africa, with a small population and mostly agriculture. What could it do that diversified away from that? And pretty much the only thing that you could actually think of was to do something with a new technology. And so making Rwanda the ICT hub for its region was the strategy that was chosen. Now, I mean, I don't think it actually was a particularly realistic strategy in the medium to long term anyway, but that's the reason why it came about. And so there was a rational process of selection of that core strategy as opposed to other development options that the incoming government could have gone for. Yeah? Is Rwanda more inclusive? I mean, the issue here is really about the relationships, which I didn't go into at all much, is that it's about the relationships between technology and power. Obviously that's not a unilateral relationship. Power structures are highly complex. There are many other aspects of it, but I think that's probably what you end up reaching to here. Does Kagame want to make Rwanda an inclusive country?
In his own version.
Is that what most governments want to do?
Well, my point here, there was a period at the time of the Maitland report where there was greater tolerance for a variety of models that could be assessed in their own terms. There was the idea of a developmental model, the idea of a liberal model, the idea of a revolutionary model. Now, and these were assessed, were considered legitimate. And it was the New World Information Communication Order and so forth. So you could tell to Paul Kagame, you have a developmental strategy and you're not doing it right. You're doing it wrong in your own terms. Now what we are saying to Paul Kagame is you're not doing what you have openly said you don't want to do. And we are ranking you for that. And this sounds a bit strange. So you have these unimodal to which certain, the UN and other organizations still believe, and then at the bottom of it, you have other models growing and not paying attention to them. So I'm not saying that Paul Kagame is a radical. I think Paul Kagame is a very problematic individual, and I don't subscribe to his agenda at all. But we have a mismatch there, where we see different ideas coming up, and we can't assess them on their own. That we can't put Paul Kagame on his own feet and say, you're doing it wrong, because he won't trust that kind of tools.
I think you could do, there's an interesting potential comparative study here, which might address some of those questions, because Rwanda wasn't the only country that made that choice at around that time. Another country which put huge investment into a national ICT strategy and so forth at that time was Mozambique. And that's very much dissipated now in terms of Mozambique's developmental approach. So it'd be quite interesting to compare those two and see what why they have evolved in different ways in that period of time. So I mean, I think I think Rwanda has overplayed the ICT
Mm.
issue and has thereby failed to address some other developmental problems. Mozambique is had very aspirational initial targets, but I think they were then not followed through, and I suppose that's probably an issue of championship and perhaps of power structures within the country.
It is 6 o'clock, but maybe we can bring in one more quick question. Does anyone have another item that is burning on their minds that they want to get rid of? No,
We wanted
it's
to wash
too.
it up.
We should have opened the doors. I think the air is getting really bad in here, and the wine is out there. So maybe we should close here. Thank you very much, David. This was a lot of food for thought. Thank you for the critical perspectives, and yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. And there's drinks outside now for everyone, as always. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.